My name, after 2 marriages and 1 divorce, is Elaine Ethel Osland, Carter Osland, Mackey. Elaine Ethel Osland, Carter Osland, Mackey. Since 1953, however, I have been known simply as Elaine Mackey. I was actually christened Ethel Elaine Osland, but my sister, Mabel, was 15 years old when I was born, and she happened to be reading a novel in which the heroine was named Elaine, so she convinced my parents to call me that. My dad, John August Osland, was born on April 8, 1876 in Fellingsbro, Zaken, Sweden. When he came to this country in 1901, he couldn't read American menus, so he would just point to the special of the day. During the summer months, that often included corn on the cob. In Sweden, corn was only used to feed livestock, so he didn't know how to eat it. Wanting to make a good impression, he tried to politely cut the corn cob into slices with a knife and fork. My mother, Edith Adeline Sandberg Osland, was born on March 26, 1885 in Kavarneholm, Strömsbrook, Sweden. She was 18 when she came to America with her younger brother, Al. They were the last of 7 children to leave their mother and their home in Sweden to come to this wonderful land. She got so ill crossing the sea that she never again wanted to make another ocean voyage, and consequently, she never again saw her mother. Mom and Dad were married on November 26, 1902, by Reverend Cornell in the parsonage of the Bethel Lutheran Church. They became naturalized citizens of these United States on June 3, 1911. My dad was 35, my mom was 26, my brother Walter was 7, and my sister Mabel was 5. By the time I was born in 1920, my parents spoke English pretty well, but they still didn't feel comfortable reading out loud, so they didn't read to me much. Instead, they told me true stories about their own lives. One of my mother's sisters was Anna Sandborg Svensson, born in Sweden on February 14, 1891. Anna and Andreas Svensson had one child, Raymond. Anna fell down a long flight of stairs and died on December 1st, 1923. My mother was very close to her sister, Hildur. Hildur's daughter Ruth and I were great friends. She was still a child when she got tuberculosis in her leg. Is that even possible? I remember visiting her in a sanitarium a few times. She was cured of the tuberculosis, but it left one leg shorter than the other, and for the rest of her life she walked with a limp. Ruth matured into a very nice-looking young lady, though, and didn't have any trouble finding boyfriends in spite of her lame leg. She married a man named Bob Cruth, so her name ended up being Ruth Cruth. When one of Mom's sisters visited, my mother would bake fresh cinnamon rolls, which my friends and I could smell from the top of Whipple Street. When we got home for a sample, my mom and aunt would be chatting away in Swedish. I understood everything they said, but I never learned to speak it. Probably because I was so shy and worried that the kids would single me out, or tease me for speaking a different language, like they did to the Italian family that lived on our block. But come to think of it, nobody ever said anything about my mother's speech. She probably could have spoken any kind of gibberish, as long as she kept handing out freshly baked cinnamon rolls to the neighborhood kids. It was fun to be a kid then. I thought I would stay that age forever. I used to say that I was glad that I would never be as old as so-and-so. There was one sister my mother spoke about who they thought had died as a small baby. In those days, I guess they didn't handle deaths as we do today. They put the body in a cold room while awaiting burial. My mother went into this cold room to see her dead little sister and noticed the child's toes wiggling. This sounds rather strange, I know, and maybe I'm remembering the story incorrectly. I don't really know whether the child survived or not, but it sort of comes to mind that my mother said that the baby's name was Anna. If that's the case, it could have been the Anna I mentioned before. In which case, she not only rose from the dead, but lived a good number of years after that before falling down the stairs. I believe we were one of the first families in our neighborhood to have a car after the horse and buggy era. My dad taught me how to drive on a Model T. On a Model T, the clutch was on the steering wheel, and to get it started, it had to be cranked. It was really a two-person operation, one to crank while the other person revved up the motor so it wouldn't stall. There were no directional signals as we have on our cars today. Instead, all directions had to be made by hand. This was a real bummer in cold, inclement weather, because every time you wanted to make a move, you had to roll down the driver's side window. To signal a left turn, the arm was extended straight out. A right turn was indicated by bending the arm at the elbow and pointing upwards. To signal a slow down or a stop, the arm was dropped straight down. The headlamps on the cars in those days lost brightness on a hard uphill climb. Pittsburgh is very hilly, and it was always dark when we headed home from Aunt Hildor's on a Sunday night. My dad told me about a time when he did lose his headlights completely, and he felt the front wheels of the car go down over something. He got out of the car to look and found that the car was barely balanced at the edge of a steep cliff. My mother was sitting in the back seat, holding me on her lap. Dad told her to stay perfectly still, not to move a muscle. He was a very strong man in those days and somehow was probably able to push the car back on solid ground. At least that's the way I think it happened. But as I think about it some more, could he really have been that strong? Anyway, somehow it worked out and we all survived. My boyfriend, Jim McHugh, and a group of friends. Everyone except me, I guess, knew how to swim and headed for the deep end of the pool and jumped in. I was too embarrassed to admit that I couldn't swim and I didn't want to be a party pooper, so I jumped in too. I panicked and started flailing around. Luckily, a lifeguard saw what was happening and jumped in to save me. My 8th grade teacher, Miss Fee, was convinced I would get a scholarship to Teachers College if I would take the academic course in high school. She even came to my house and talked to my parents, hoping they could convince me to go that route. In those days, teachers resigned when they got married, and all the teachers I knew were old maids. Heaven forbid, I didn't want to be an old maid, so I insisted on taking the commercial course. In later years, of course, the rules changed and teachers could marry and even have children and still keep their jobs. When I graduated from high school in 1938, we were in the middle of the Great Depression, so jobs in any field were hard to come by. Just to occupy my time until I could get a job, I enrolled in an office machines course. We learned to use adding machines, calculators, fiddle machines, mimeograph machines, etc. To make a lot of copies, you type the material on a stencil and then run it off on a mimeograph machine. It was a really messy job. Since I had the use of a mimeograph machine anyway, I composed a letter of application for employment, mimeographed 100 copies, and mailed them to companies I picked from the telephone directory. I finally got a job working for an automobile loan company for the truly fabulous salary of $15 per week. It was while I was working for the auto loan company that I was hospitalized for appendicitis. Jim and I had gone to a movie when I started to feel like I had a stomachache. By the next morning, the pain had all settled on my right side, and my appendix was removed later that day. It was December 7th, 1941. When I came out of the ether, my mother, father, and Jim were in my room talking about the attack on Pearl Harbor and the fact that the United States was declaring war on Japan. I thought I was dreaming, but believe me, this was all too real. Dad was such a good mechanic, and he was very proud of the fact that he could keep that old jalopy running. In cold weather, he would pick me up after work at the streetcar stop so I wouldn't have that long, icy walk home on Whipple Street. Boy, I tell you, that little Model A Ford sitting there when I got off the streetcar might as well have been a ritzy Cadillac. I was always so happy to see it. And my dad, of course. I often think of how good he was to me in spite of the pain he must have been suffering. Only years later did I learn he had prostate cancer. Because I was single, my parents wouldn't think of talking to me about any sexual body part. Dad died in April of 1943. He was in a coma when I got home from work one day, so I sat up with him all night. He died while I was sitting by his side. Just before he died, he reached up his hands and said, "Take me, Jesus." That moment has forever lingered in my memory, and I often wonder if he really did see something. Dad had always worn a mustache, but because he was so ill, he was completely unshaven when he died, so the mortician shaved his whole face. It was the first time any of us had ever seen him without his mustache. After Dad died, my mother sold our house on Whipple Street and all its contents, except for some things with sentimental value, silverware, dishes from Sweden, etc. In September of 1943, Mom and I boarded the California Zephyr for a cross-country trip to Los Angeles. The plan was to spend 3 months with Aunt Tina and Uncle Charlie in Los Angeles, and then return to Detroit to live near my sister, Mabel. The train was very crowded with servicemen since it was still wartime. At one stop, Mom and I were talking to some servicemen, and one of them turned out to be a friend of Spear, the boyfriend of the sister of my boyfriend, Jim. That night, on my way back from the bathroom to my berth, this hand reached out and pulled me into a lower berth. It was Spear's friend. He was all over me. I struggled and cried. I told him I needed a Kleenex. He loosened his grip on me a little when I reached for my purse, and I was able to break free, so I jumped out and ran to my berth. I was afraid to tell my mother about the incident for fear that she would want to cancel our trip. Jobs were quite plentiful during the war years, so I had no trouble getting hired at Arden Farms Dairy on Slauson Avenue in Pasadena. It was just about 2 blocks from Aunt Tina's, so I could walk to work. Shortly after I started to work, I met Jerry Landon Carter. We became romantically involved, and he proposed marriage to me. I accepted his proposal, but as I look back on things, it may have been for all the wrong reasons. He was a very handsome man and a very talented musician, and I'm sure I felt I was in love with him. However, there was one other thing that may have influenced my decision. My mother intended to return to Detroit at the end of our 3-month stay, and she made it quite clear to me that she wasn't going to leave her single daughter alone in California. That sort of presents an ultimatum to me: either get married or return to Detroit. Was that I was still engaged to Jim McHugh in Pittsburgh. I wrote a Dear John letter to Jim, but he didn't take the news lying down. He hitchhiked from Pittsburgh across the country to Los Angeles to try and talk me out of it. That was a really stressful time for me. I never was very good at trying to date more than one man at a time, but Aunt Tina had invited Jim to stay at their house since he had traveled such a long way. So I would see Jim every day, and he would try to talk me out of marrying Jerry. Then I would see Jerry every day at work, and he would try to make sure I didn't change my mind about him. felt terrible about hurting Jim. But to ease my conscience a little, I thought back to the hurt he had caused me by cheating on me when we were supposed to be going steady. Jerry quit his office job when he was hired as a singer and accordionist with Ole Rasmussen and the Nebraska Cornhuskers. I loved to dance and went to all the dances and nightclubs when Jerry was playing. I was so shy, though, that I needed a glass or two of wine to really kick up my heels. I'm thinking of that Cab Calloway song. If you'd like to be a jitterbug, first thing you must do is get a jug. Put whiskey, wine, and gin within and shake it all up and then begin. Grab a cup and start to toss. You are drinking jitter sauce. Don't you worry, you just mug, and then you'll be a jitterbug. One of the regulars that I danced with was a fellow named Curly. Curly was actually bald and not good looking at all, but he was by far the best dancer in the hall. When we jitterbugged, he tap danced the steps, and people would just stop dancing and watch us. It seemed like such a glamorous and gay life for a girl from Pittsburgh. Of course, it wasn't so glamorous to get up early every morning to go to my office job while Jerry had nothing to do all day. I suspected he was having an affair. I also wanted children, and he didn't. He thought fatherhood would ruin his wannabe movie star persona. We sold the house, split the proceeds 50-50, and moved into separate apartments. My mother had moved back to Los Angeles around this time. I was her baby, and I think she just missed me. One day during that period, she and I attended the Queen for a Day radio show. We were in the live audience, and my mother slumped over onto my shoulder and died of a heart attack. If you have to go, and of course we all do, I can't think of a better way to do it. Quickly, without pain, after a good laugh. My mother died on August 2nd, 1950. Soon after her funeral, I went to Reno, Nevada. I stayed the 6 weeks required to establish residency and filed for divorce. I got a job in the Mapes Hotel Casino working as a shill. It was an interesting diversion from secretarial work. I worked the graveyard shift. In the middle of the night, the crowds would thin out, and people hesitated to sit at an empty table and play one-on-one with the dealer. So my job was to fill in at any one of the tables, blackjack, craps, roulette, when ordered by the shift boss. On one occasion, I was filling in at the craps table, and I was hot, as they say. A man at that table was betting on my dice rolls, And at one point, he said he would give me $100 if I rolled a hard 10, which is 2 5s. He made a side bet on that hard 10, and what do you know? I made it, and I got the $100 tip. That was exciting. My mother died on August 2nd, 1950. My divorce was final in March 1951. I passed the Federal Civil Service Overseas Employees Exam in April, was assigned a position in May, and on June 29th, 1951, at 12:01 Pacific Time, the Los Angeles Limited pulled out from Union Station in Los Angeles, California, and I was on my way to Salzburg, Austria. On July 6, 1951, I boarded a C-97 plane for Europe. There were 36 passengers on the plane, all seated in bucket seats along one side, and the other side was loaded with cargo. It was my first plane, and I felt a little queasy. All the other passengers were men, so when we landed, being a very shy person, I waited for what seemed like hours for all the men to go through customs first in order to avoid any embarrassment, in case I had to open my suitcase and possibly reveal my undergarments in front of them. I took a train from Frankfurt to Munich, which was a bit depressing. Remember, this was not long after the war was over, so I saw the remains of many bombed buildings. Then, on July 12, 1951, I boarded a train to Salzburg. One Saturday night, I had a date with Eddie, an officer who traveled back and forth between Salzburg and Vienna. He asked me if it would be okay if we double-dated with another couple that evening. He had just met Gail in the Funkhaus, sort of a coffee shop across the street from the Pitter Hotel. Eddie had just given me a bracelet, which I was about to put on when he arrived with Gail and his date. Gail offered to fasten the bracelet for me. As the evening went on, I was actually a little embarrassed that he paid more attention to me than to his date, Sylvia. The next day when I got home, Gail was waiting for me at the Pitter Hotel desk. He said that Eddie had had too much to drink and was passed out in Gail's room. The truth of the matter was, Gail had purposely given Eddie as many free drinks as he wanted, while Gail himself stayed perfectly sober, so he could meet me and take me out to dinner alone. From then on, Gail and Elaine were an item. love, strolling through the gardens at the foot of Winkle Mountain and singing all our favorite songs from the 30s and 40s. I loved to sing, and Gail was really good at picking out a harmony to sing with my lead. Our song became only make-believe because the words really seemed to fit our situation. He was separated from his wife of 8 years, and I was just divorced from my husband, and neither one of us were looking for a serious relationship. We could make believe I love you, only make believe that you love me. Others find peace of mind in pretending. Couldn't you, couldn't I, couldn't we? Make believe our lips are blending in a phantom kiss, or 2, or 3. Might as well make believe that I love you, 'cause to tell the truth, I do. Gail and I were married on June 6, 1953, wearing traditional Austrian lederhosen. It wouldn't have been appropriate to wear white since it was my second marriage. As I mentioned, I really wanted to have a child, but after almost 2 years, I still had not gotten pregnant. Following the doctor's orders, I used to take my temperature and literally call Gail out of whatever meeting he was in when the temperature was right. He didn't seem to mind that so much. In the meantime, Gail's 2 sons from his previous marriage to Althea had come to live with us. Althea was a heavy drinker and often left the boys unattended while she painted the town red in Mexico City. Gail felt bad about their situation, and since Gail and I were hoping to start a family anyway, we decided to bring them to live with us. Alan was 13 and Bucky was 8 when they arrived in Salzburg. Shortly after they came to live with us, I started feeling nauseated all the time. I didn't associate the nausea with pregnancy right away, but it was. I guess mothering the 2 boys got my body in the mothering mood, and it finally took. Started sharing the news well before we were supposed to. When our Austrian friend, Walter van Neudig, poked his head into Gail's office to see if he had asked me about playing bridge that evening, he said, "Hast du deine Frau gefragt?" To which Gail replied, "Yes, and she is pregnant." On February 14th, 1956, my only biological son was born, Stephen N.M.I. Mackey. Or, as Gail used to say, Stephen Enema Mackey. From the time I brought Stevie home from the hospital, I started singing to him when I put him down in his crib for the night. A medley of "I Love You a Bushel and a Peck" and "Good Night, Sweetheart." We were a family of 5, albeit a rather mixed-up one. Gail adopted Alan, who was Althea's son from her first marriage, so Alan and Bucky were half-brothers, sharing a mother, and Bucky and Steve were half-brothers, sharing a father. Alan was always sweet and grateful for my care, even though he was a teenager. But if I had a nickel for every time Bucky said, "I don't have to do what you say, you aren't my mother," I would have been a rich woman. Gail was happy to let me play the role of bad cop when he got home, so he wasn't much help. That's just how it was back then. I had stopped drinking while I was pregnant and breastfeeding, but the doctor said Stephen was not getting enough milk, so we switched to a bottle and he thrived. Then I was relieved to cap off the day spent as mean old stepmother with a cocktail as soon as Gail got home. Gail worked for Uncle Sam for 40 years. He always said that there was no way he could have worked for the same boss for that long unless you could change jobs every couple of years. In June of 1956, it was time for the Mackey family to leave Europe. Gail was accepted for a posting at Andersen Air Base on the island of Guam. Guam is part of the Mariana Islands and is known as the poor man's Hawaii. It was a tropical climate, however, and there were lots of creepy, crawly things. And the roaches, ooh-wee, they were huge and had such hard shells. One night I heard Stevie crying. At first, I thought a rat may have gotten to him because I had heard stories that rats chewed on babies' fingers while they lay in their cribs. I rushed into his room, and it turned out that he was awakened by the noise of a roach clattering along the hardwood floor. What I just said makes it sound like Guam was a horrible place to live, but not true. The Pacific Ocean was magical. Almost every evening, there would be an impromptu party at the beach, and we would use a bubble from the nose of an airplane as a punch bowl. The favorite punch of the group was bola, made with pineapple, which had been soaked in brandy for days, and then champagne and ginger ale were added at serving time. One could really get a buzz on just by eating a few pineapple chunks. One of the revelers was Joe Drobny, the Air Force band leader. He appeared with his band on a weekly TV show. Each week, he would have a local talent make a guest appearance. Joe borrowed our tape recorder on one occasion, and it happened to have some recordings of me singing some of my favorite old standards. Joe was favorably impressed and invited me to sing on his TV show. The thought of it scared me to death, but he assured me it would be just like singing into my tape recorder at home, because there was no one in the studio except for him and the band. I did it, and everyone was really nice and reassuring to me, and it all went well. In fact, Joe later said he had had many requests for me to sing again. I'm sure he was just flattering me, but I said okay and appeared 2 more times. All in all, I sang Embraceable You, Night and Day, I'm in the Mood for Love, and a medley of Angry, and I Can't Give You Anything But Love. Night and Day was kind of my signature. The ocean had its frightening aspects too. One afternoon, the whole family was at the beach, and I walked home to start dinner and left Gail in charge of keeping an eye on little Stevie, who was playing in an inner tube. Well, when I returned, Bucky and Alan were off playing with their friends. Gail was sound asleep on the beach, and little Steve had floated way out from the shore. The Coast Guard had to go out and get him. shudder to think of all the things that could have happened. I was furious with Gail. Speaking of wearisome events, we had a couple while living in Fairfield, California as well. Steve, who was just about 3 years old at the time, always played in the driveway of our house, so we always knew where to find him when it was time to come in. On this particular day, however, he was not in front of the house and nowhere in sight. All of us, Gail, Alan, Bucky, and me, walked up and down the block, around the block, everywhere, calling out, "Stevie, Stevie." Alan went driving around the neighborhood and heard a thumping in the back of his car. He opened the trunk to look, and there was little Stevie. Somehow he had managed to climb in and close the trunk door. We had another heart-stopping incident with our little Stevie. Bucky and Steve were sitting in the front seat of the car with me while driving to a local grocery store. Bucky was sitting in the middle and Steve had crawled in beside him. Evidently, the door hadn't been closed tightly and flew open while I was going around a corner. This time it was Bucky who was the hero. He was quick thinking and grabbed Stevie when the door flew open and saved him from falling out. Sometimes I wonder how kids ever reach adulthood. And there was one more a few years later. Our friends from Guam, the Millers, were living in Perth Amboy, New Jersey, and they threw a bowler party in our honor when we returned from England and landed at McGuire Air Base. We were playing bridge while Steve stayed cool in their swimming pool, which was enclosed by a 5-foot-tall chain-link fence. Their pool had a shallow ledge that ran all the way around. 7-year-old Steve didn't know how to swim, but was happily walking around the side, holding onto the ledge. As far as he knew, I guess, the whole pool was that depth, so after a while he stepped towards the center. We were terrified when we saw him flailing around, and Gail leapt over the fence in a single bound. It was really like one of those stories where adrenaline gives you superpowers. By the time Gail got to Steve, he had made his way pretty close to the side, so Gail could drag him out without even jumping in. He coughed up some water and had a headache, but nothing long-lasting. He did say that his life, all 7 years of it, passed before his eyes.
I remember that, and I remember how strongly you and Dad encouraged me to get back on the horse that threw me by swimming in the motel pools we encountered on the road trip from Perth Amboy to Marysville, California. I've since wondered if the recurring nightmares I had during that first summer in Marysville were related to feeling suffocated in the Miller's pool. I would wake up terrified that I was being buried alive, and you and Dad would turn on all the lights, air conditioners, TVs, radios to reassure me. That passed, and actually what was harder for me that summer was finding out that Bucky and Alan were not simply my brothers. I remember being in the pediatrician's office for the first time in Marysville. He asked if I had any siblings, and you replied, no. Well, one half-brother, they share a father, and an adopted brother with no biological relation. I was shocked, and it took me a little time to process it. My belief that we were a normal family had been a comforting antidote to the rootless feeling that came with moving every year or two. The shock wasn't just that Bucky and Alan were not regular brothers, but that you and Dad had both been married before and that those marriages didn't last. That raised the stakes for every argument between you and Dad that I overheard. Marriage, family, everything was fragile. Suddenly my world seemed insecure and chaotic, like I'd stepped out of a Norman Rockwell painting onto a Jackson Pollock canvas. And then a couple of months later, just to make things a little more ragged, President Kennedy was assassinated. And that was the first time I ever heard you cry.
Marysville was close to San Francisco, Napa wine country, Lake Tahoe, and other sites and destinations in California, and so we had regular visits from the friends we'd made overseas. One of the outings we would take guests on was a trip to San Francisco to look at the hippies in the Haight-Ashbury district. Flower power had become an international movement, and so visitors were always very interested to see the hair, fashion, and lifestyle. Marv and Shayla Ritzman were friends of Gail's from his Mexico City days. They were both heavy drinkers. In fact, Marv would wake up to a beer most mornings when everyone else would have a cup of coffee. During one trip to San Francisco, we took them out for a big prime rib dinner. Apparently, I drank more than I thought, and must have been 3 sheets to the wind, as they say, because on the way home, right after that big dinner, I suggested we stop and get a bite to eat because I haven't had a thing to eat all day except a little piece of beef jerky. I got teased for that for years to come. By 1969, we'd landed a man on the moon. Bucky and Alan both had teaching jobs and were living on their own. I had gone through menopause, and little Stevie was now a teenager. Steve really wanted to have long hair. Maybe he was inspired by those trips to the Haight, but he was also very self-conscious about his big ears and wanted hair long enough to cover them. Kids taunted him with comments like, "Hey, Mackey, can you wiggle your ears?" He actually did learn how to wiggle his ears, and even learned how to wiggle each ear at a different speed. It was really impressive. Anyway, Steve really wanted to have long hair, but Gail would not allow it. As a career military employee, the idea that his son would become a long-haired, pot-smoking hippie terrified him. We didn't believe in spanking, but when Steve had been told to get a haircut and returned home still looking like a hippie, it really infuriated Gail. That was the only time he ever tried to hit Steve, and it was only a glancing blow. Gail felt so bad after striking Steve. He said to me, "It's stupid to let something as silly as a haircut come between me and my son." Steve could wear his hair as long as he liked from then on. When we moved to Tacoma, Steve's new high school had a dress code that prohibited boys' hair to cover the ears. Gail pounded his fist on the table and said, "If I'm not going to tell my son how to wear his hair, no school board is going to tell him either." So they went out and bought a short-haired wig that he could wear during school and take off at 3 o'clock to let his shoulder-length locks hang down. Around this time, Gail and I started to argue about my drinking. I didn't think I had a problem. Remember, my first husband was a musician, and Gail was connected to the military. And the only people who drink more than musicians are military personnel. Especially overseas, where the booze was cheap at the base PX. One evening, an argument started about something or other, and it quickly turned into a fight about my drinking. I guess by 6 o'clock, I was usually pretty out of it, and Gail was so fed up that he stormed off, went into the bathroom, slammed the door, and punched 2 holes through the door with his bare fists.
In elementary school, I always thought Dad overreacted to your drinking, but by the time I was 13 or 14, I knew what drunk looked like, and I started to understand his desperation. Either way, my adolescent narcissism was not very helpful, and I do apologize for that. At the time, your alcoholism was my problem, both in the sense that I was more focused on its inconvenience for me rather than trying to empathize with what you were going through. But also, as a therapist unpacked with me years later, I think I felt responsible for your drinking. I felt it was my job to get you to stop. I'm sorry for all of that.
I was always a night owl, and Gail went to bed very early and read. During the summer months, when Steve didn't have school in the morning and I didn't have to go to my job as a school secretary, I would send Steve out on his bike to Taco Bell. It's a good thing that he was young and athletic, because really he often had to rush to get there before they closed at 11. When he'd return, we would chow down, as Steve used to say, and watch Johnny Carson.
I have to laugh when I think about those Taco Bell runs. I knew that you would take the opportunity to have a drink or two, so I took the opportunity to smoke a joint, knowing that Dad would be asleep and you would be drunk by the time I got home. I picture the scene of the two of us buzzed with our respective munchies watching Johnny. Probably not how the experts would have scripted family time, but I felt safe and close to you.
Another taco story. Steve turned 16 while we were in Tacoma, and for his birthday he wanted me to make his favorite meal, tacos. I wanted to make it special, so I thought I better get an early start to dinner. Besides, I always allowed myself to sip a glass of wine while I was cooking dinner, even if it was 2 in the afternoon. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in the emergency room at the hospital. Apparently, I had been so under the influence that I grated part of my hand instead of the cheese. By the time Steve got home from school, I was passed out on the kitchen floor in a puddle of my own blood. I was so sorry for putting him through that, and I knew I had to get my drinking under control. I investigated AA, and while I understood that alcoholism was a disease, the shame and stigma seemed the hardest to overcome. I would need a drink if I were to stand up and talk in an AA meeting, so that never worked for me. Anyway, I was on and off the wagon a couple more years after the taco incident. Steve, in the middle of his drive home from college on the weekends, always seemed to sense whether I was sober or not. If he sensed that I was drinking, he would prepare whatever friend he might have brought home with him. He claims he had a mild case of ESP.
Some of those pre-homecoming phone calls were dead giveaways that you were off the wagon, but there were some calls that did require some sensitivity, if not ESP. Maybe a hint of frustration in Dad's voice, and even if you happened to be sober at the time of the call, I felt like I could hear something in your voice. Loneliness or guilt. I just thought it was awkward if a new friend didn't know what was going on when you started to slur your speech and struggle to keep your balance after dinner. I was never embarrassed with you, though. You were a bit maudlin, but at least you weren't a mean or abusive drunk like Mike's dad or Randy's mom.
I hit rock bottom in the summer of 1974. To be honest, some of the details of this next story I remember more from Steve's description than from my own memory. Steve was home from college and I was passed out in the afternoon while Gail was at work. Apparently, Steve got so fed up with my drinking, he went searching to find all the vodka bottles I had hidden throughout the house. He did a pretty good job too, because I looked for one without success when I woke up. By that time, Steve had gone to get some food to bring home. I needed a drink, so I walked to the nearest liquor store, bought a bottle of vodka, and drank most of it on the way out of the store. By the time I got into the parking lot, I must have been so drunk that I collapsed. I don't remember a thing until the next morning when the local newspaper printed a picture of me, face down in the parking lot. I was so humiliated by this, and I was ashamed that I had to miss several days of work in a row, which I had managed never to do before. I never took another drink after that. And it has been 30 years to the writing of this in 2004. I'm not at all shy anymore. There once was a time when one of the hardest things about quitting was the thought of walking into a party and have one of the hosts ask, "What would you like to drink?" Heaven forbid I say ginger ale. Now at a party or even at a restaurant when someone asks, I simply say, "No thank you, I'm a recovering alcoholic," and that does the trick. Gail took an early retirement in 1975, and we continued to travel the world until he had a stroke in 1990. He died on December 23rd, 1993. But I continued to talk to him every night, and he gave me some good advice over the years. I had no interest in sharing my life with another man, except for my grand dog Mackey, Steve's black lab, who I stayed with while Steve was traveling. I joined the Sweet Adelines, a female barbershop quartet that performed in public and entered competitions. So much for that old bashful me. I made a lot of good friends through that. I tried to carry on my mother's old Swedish superstitions and traditions. If you eat chicken on New Year's Day, you'll be scratching all year. But if you eat pork, you'll root all year. That was easy for me because I really like pork chops and sauerkraut. It was supposed to be good luck for a man to enter a house first on New Year's Day. Sometimes that would be Mackey, after Gail died and if Steve was away. Never sing before breakfast or you'll cry before supper. That was Steve's favorite. That phrase inspired him to write a musical composition which he titled Never Sing Before Breakfast.
Considering all the love, respect, and gratitude I've had for you over the years, I'm a little embarrassed to admit that until reading your memoir, I thought of you solely as a supporting character in my movie. But now I can finally see you as the star of a rich, complex, heroic comic drama of your own. One of the most heroic stories, a story that you couldn't include in your own memoir, obviously, is the story of your own passing. I want to make sure my children hear it, so it will be prominent in my own memoir. I imagine it as a sort of extended epigraph. Why don't you read it now?
My mother worried a great deal about being embarrassed. She was too embarrassed to admit she couldn't swim, so she jumped in the deep end and proved it in spectacular fashion. She nearly died of embarrassment many times, but that didn't kill her in the end. For much of her life, alcohol was her cure for embarrassment, until embarrassment became the cure for alcohol. Maybe in the end, shame saved her and made possible an actual death that was sweet, like she was. She was diagnosed with esophageal cancer in 2004. I was with her when she found out. It was a sharp but poetic irony that the first words out of the doctor's mouth after breaking the news was to ask if she was a heavy drinker. She gave me a wry smile. She was treated with chemo and radiation and was able to dance with me at my wedding in 2006. She remained cancer-free until reoccurrence in 2007. Around that same time, my wife found out that she was pregnant, and my mom was so excited, and she vowed to fight the cancer again and meet her grandchild. Unfortunately, we lost the pregnancy, and of course we had to tell her, to which she replied, "I know you will have a happy, healthy family, but I can't wait another year." A week later, she called me and asked that I visit earlier than usual on that day because today will be my last day, she said. When I arrived at the assisted living facility where she lived, the nurses and aides all ran up to me and said, "Your mom called us to thank us for our care and said that today would be her last day." As I entered her apartment, I said, "Mom, I don't want you to be bummed out if you wake up tomorrow morning and you aren't dead." She laughed and then handed me a folder with all the procedures I should follow after her passing, complete with phone numbers to call, a recommended order of things to do, and comments like, "As soon as I die, call the funeral home. I prepaid for basic cremation, so don't let them try to sell you anything fancy. And the cable company should prorate this month. I'm not watching TV for 31 days, so you shouldn't have to pay for 31 days. Everything she was doing was aimed at making things easier for me. I started to tear up and she said, "Steve, please don't be sad. I've had a wonderful life. Please tell everyone I had a beautiful passing."
Then she told me to just go about my business and work on my laptop while she slipped away in the background. After a couple of hours, she was no longer communicative, but still breathing. I knew from watching my father die that sometimes people need to be given permission to let go. I gave her that permission, but there was no change. The day before, she had brought up the lullaby medley she used to sing when I was a child, and we sang them together. "Good Night, Sweetheart," and "I Love You, a Bushel and a Peck." It occurred to me that maybe she was hoping I would sing these songs to her now, and perhaps that would help her pass. I sang, but no change. Eventually, my wife showed up with some takeout. The 7 to 10 minutes it took for us to set up the TV trays and plate the dinner was the longest stretch I'd gone without checking on her. And it was also the only time during that day that I was not alone. So, of course, she picked that time to let go. I was moved by her strength, fearlessness, and serenity, all the more impressive in contrast to the frantic chatter around her, myself included. The peer pressure, as it were, was telling her that she had no agency in this matter, but she quietly disagreed and went about her business. Mackey died on August 28th, 2007. It was indeed a beautiful passing.